You've got 1 hour to tear down that monstrosity, or I'll personally haul you off this property." That's what Margaret Holloway, the iron-fisted president of the HOA, growled at me exactly 60 minutes after I finally sat down to enjoy my new front porch for the very first time. Her black SUV had come barreling up my freshly laid driveway like she was launching a military invasion. From behind curtains and half-cracked blinds, neighbors watched in breathless silence as she waved a stack of papers at me like she was serving a sentence. She may have thought she was the law around here, but I just smiled. If she had even the slightest clue about the notarized documents with that faded red county seal I held in my hand, the documents that could unravel her entire HOA empire like a loose thread, she probably wouldn't have dared step foot on my property. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment, because what happens when that red seal finally sees daylight will leave you stunned. 3 days. That's all the time I'd spent living in Willow Creek before Margaret Holloway, who might as well have had Iron Fist stitched on her name Tonga, decided to declare war on me. I'd moved here after the divorce, looking for a clean slate and hoping to give my 12-year-old son, Tyler, a quiet neighborhood to ride his bike in somewhere without city traffic or constant noise. The house had belonged to my grandfather, a modest 2-story colonial he'd left to me when he passed away 2 years ago. Back then, I was too tangled up in the wreckage of my marriage to do anything with it besides keep the taxes paid and have someone mow the grass twice a month. But now, with Tyler spending weekends with me, the apartment downtown didn't feel like enough anymore. The house seemed like the right move. What I didn't anticipate was stepping straight into a battlefield the moment I arrived. The trouble began the very first morning. Tyler and I were checking out the old workshop shed out back, the one my grandfather had built decades ago, when a black Escalade screeched into my driveway like the driver was fleeing a heist. Out stepped a woman in her late 50s, dressed in crisp khakis and a tucked-in polo shirt that practically screamed, "I need to speak to the manager." She held a clipboard like it was a sword she'd pulled from a stone. Margaret Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. She introduced herself with all the self-importance of royalty. She barely acknowledged me before striding straight to the shed, whipping out a measuring tape as if she were solving a murder. "This structure," she declared, pointing at Grandpa Harold's workshop with the dramatic flair of a courtroom judge, "is in direct violation of HOA Code. Section 47 clearly prohibits accessory buildings taller than 8 feet without prior written consent." Tyler looked up at me with those wide, uncertain eyes kids get when they know the adults are about to go to war. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder while Margaret continued her show. She was live-streaming the whole ordeal, narrating it like a reality TV villain to her dozen or so online followers, talking about community standards and property values like she was saving civilization. To hear her talk, you'd think my grandfather's humble shed was a criminal operation disguised as a backyard project. But what cut deeper than her smug condescension was the way Tyler's face fell when she started rattling off threats about demolitions and deadlines. He'd already been through more than enough upheaval. Now, the one place that still carried his great-grandfather's legacy was under siege by someone drunk on homeowner power. That evening, after Margaret marched off promising to take this to the board, I sat Tyler down in the kitchen over pizza, trying to figure out how to explain HOA politics to a 12-year-old who just wanted a fresh start. He barely touched his slice. Then he looked up and quietly asked, "Are we going to have to move again?" It hit me like a sucker punch. This kid had lived through his parents' constant arguing, the awkward custody arrangements, and now he was afraid he might lose the first real home he'd had since it all fell apart. I told him no, only and not even a clipboard warrior was going to force us out. But the truth, I didn't have a clue how I'd make that promise stick. That night, unable to sleep, I went back out to the shed to take a better look around. I remembered how meticulous my grandfather had always been, especially with documents. He'd worked for years as a real estate attorney, and he'd never let a file go unorganized. Sure enough, hidden behind the workbench, I found the safe. The combination, written on masking tape, stuck to the bottom of his toolbox, a classic Harold. Inside the safe was a thick manila folder, crammed with paperwork dating back decades, all of them stamped, sealed, and signed with official-looking marks. But the one on top made my heart skip a beat. Willow Creek Estate, original land grant, 1987, a red seal from the county, faded now, but unmistakable. As I flipped through the pages, my hands started to tremble, not out of fear, but because everything suddenly made sense. My grandfather hadn't just owned this house, he'd owned the land Willow Creek was built on. Every single home, even the so-called community center where Margaret liked to hold her little HOA court sessions, it all sat on land originally granted to Harold Westbrook. The HOA? It hadn't even been established until 1995, 8 years later. And it turned out, no one had ever verified whether the association even had legal authority over this parcel of land. The ownership had never been properly transferred. I sat there in the quiet workshop, surrounded by the scent of old timber and Grandpa's tools, holding the kind of leverage that could collapse Margaret Holloway's fiefdom like a sandcastle in the tide. Upstairs, Tyler was fast asleep, dreaming about bikes and maybe new friends. He had no idea his great-grandfather had just handed us the ultimate shield against HOA tyranny. The next morning, Margaret came back. Her SUV thundered down the street like a lead vehicle in a parade of bureaucratic vengeance. This time, 2 more vehicles followed, carrying what I could only assume were fellow board members. They approached like an execution squad, papers and scowls in hand. Margaret held a new clipboard and what looked like official county documents, wearing a smirk that said she thought she'd won. As they climbed my porch steps, I stayed seated with my coffee. Tyler peeked nervously from behind the curtain. Then she cleared her throat like she was about to address Parliament. "Mr. Westbrook," she declared, her voice loud enough for the nosy neighbors to hear from their mailboxes, "we've reviewed county records. A broken bar officials have confirmed that your structure breaches multiple city regulations. You've got 1 hour to begin tearing it down, or we'll be forced to take legal action." She delivered the line like a prosecutor issuing a verdict, sliding a thick packet of documents into my hand with theatrical flair. Her phone was already recording, capturing what she clearly hoped would be my surrender. I accepted the stack calmly, offered a polite smile to Margaret's little entourage, and set the papers down next to my coffee cup without sparing them a second glance. "Well," I said evenly, adrenaline pulsing just beneath my steady tone, "that's certainly one way to handle this." A flicker of confusion crossed her face as she'd expected resistance, maybe anger or panic, not indifference. Behind her, I caught Rosa Martinez pretending to water her already soaked begonias while straining to hear every word, and old Betty Morrison across the street had completely dropped the act, sitting on her porch, watching like she had front row seats to a soap opera. Tyler's face appeared at the window again. I gave him a little wavy, just enough to show him I had things under control. What none of them, not Margaret, not her board, not the nosy neighbors, saw was that I was sitting on legal dynamite. A single spark from the documents hidden in my grandfather's safe could level everything Margaret thought she controlled. And in just under an hour, once I finished my coffee and Tyler had eaten his pancakes, she'd get a first-hand lesson in what happens when you pick the wrong fight. For now, I was happy to let her believe she'd won. The look on her face when she realized she hadn't, that was going to be worth every second. I didn't have to wait long for Margaret to go nuclear. By Monday morning, my inbox was flooded with emails from an account labeled willowcreekhoa@gmail.com. The subject line screamed in all caps, "Urgent. New resident violating community standards." Not just me, every single household in the neighborhood had received the same message. Attached were high-resolution photos of my grandfather's shed taken from multiple angles, complete with digital measurements, annotations, and dramatic arrows pointing at every so-called violation. The email even included a paragraph subtly accusing certain homeowners of believing they were above the rules that keep Willow Creek safe and valuable. But what really caught my attention was a PDF titled Emergency Community Response Protocol. Reading it felt like going through a neighborhood doomsday plan. Margaret had basically drafted a mini militia operation against my shida as if it were a biohazard. I had to admit, the woman was thorough. Deranged, yes, but thorough. Then came Tuesday. Tyler and I were on the back patio, sipping juice and going over his math homework before school when we heard a strange buzzing overhead. It sounded like a mechanical wasp. Tyler looked up first and pointed excitedly. "Dad, is that thing spying on us?" Hovering about 30 feet above us was a drone, circling like a digital hawk. I wasn't sure how to answer his question in a way that wouldn't make him paranoid about stepping into the backyard. The drone made several slow passes over the workshop, recording every angle, before it veered off toward Margaret's house a few blocks over. I made a mental note to check the laws on drone surveillance over private property. But more importantly, I started thinking about how Margaret was escalating and how she had no idea she was picking a fight with someone who built software for a living. If she wanted to bring tech into this, she was about to learn what a digital counteroffensive looked like. Wednesday brought her next stunt: posters. On our walk to the bus stop, I noticed thema bright yellow flyers slapped on every mailbox, lamppost, and street sign within a 3-block radius. Neighborhood Watch Report. Suspicious activity. The flyers included a number to call with any safety concerns. It was no coincidence. Margaret was trying to cast my presencia and my grandfather's workshop as a threat to the neighborhood, twisting it into some imagined danger to the children. What bothered me wasn't the smear campaign itself, but the subtle shift in the way people looked at me. Parents at the bus stop stopped making eye contact. Tyler noticed, too. He tugged on my sleeve and asked, "Why won't Mrs. Peterson say hi anymore?" Just days ago, she'd offered us banana bread and neighborhood tips. Now she was glued to her phone, pretending we didn't exist. Margaret's attacks weren't just about my property. They were about our place in this community. She was making sure we'd never feel like we belonged. That afternoon, while Tyler was at school, I went back to my grandfather's paperwork. Harold Westbrook had kept a meticulous record of everything. His files were so well organized they could have been used to teach law students. I found correspondence with the county, zoning applications, old development maps, an entire archive that outlined the birth of Willow Creek. The most revealing file was labeled, HOA Concerns, 1995–1998. Inside were handwritten notes, letters, and legal references that made one thing clear: Harold had known from the beginning that the HOA wasn't on solid ground. His legal training was evident in every line: dates, names, citations. He had been building a quiet case, though for reasons I didn't yet understand, he never brought it forward. One note, scribbled just 6 months before he died, stopped me cold. Daniel needs to know the truth about the land rights. They never had authority. That evening, I got an unexpected knock at the door. It was Betty Morrison, holding a plate of cookies and a look that said she had something serious to say. Betty, 75 years old, had lived across the street for 3 decades. She had seen more HOA drama unfold from her porch than most lawyers see in a courtroom. She settled into my kitchen chair like she'd been rehearsing this conversation for years. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He always said that HOA was built on shaky ground." But Harold was too polite to stir things up when folks were just trying to get by. She told me more about Margareta, how she moved here 8 years ago after losing everything to a corrupt HOA in another state. "That's why she's so controlling," Betty explained, nibbling at a cookie. "She's terrified of losing control again, so now she clutches it with both hands and never lets go." The next morning, Margaret launched her boldest attack yet. A broken bar. Tyler and I were mid-breakfast when the doorbell rang so hard and fast it felt like someone trying to wake the entire neighborhood. I opened the door to find Margaret standing there like an authority figure from a bad procedural drama. Clipboard in one hand, a measuring tape in the other, and beside her stood a man wearing a county badge and looking like he deeply regretted his life choices that morning. "Mr. Westbrook," she announced loudly, her voice projected just enough to draw the attention of every neighbor within earshot. "This is Building Inspector Johnson from the county office. He's here to perform a formal violation assessment." The inspector looked like he'd rather be anywhere else and uncomfortable, caught in the middle of something clearly more personal than procedural. Margaret, on the other hand, was practically glowing with satisfaction. No doubt she'd spent hours pulling strings or inflating her claims just to get him here. I felt Tyler inch behind me, peering out at the small crowd already gathering on our lawn. His anxious expression was becoming far too familiar. But while Margaret had been busy stirring drama and launching surveillance missions, I'd been doing a bit of recon myself. A helpful clerk at the county records office had provided after a $50 fee, a detailed folder of everything relating to Willow Creek's original development, land grants, transfers, zoning approvals, a broken bar, and most crucially, the legal backbone of the Homeowners Association. What I found shocked me. The HOA had formed in 1995, but the land Willow Creek sat on was originally granted to my grandfather, Harold Westbrook, in 1987 and had never been formally handed over to a development firm or municipal entity. In other words, Margaret's entire operation stood on land my family still, in all likelihood, legally owned. So when Inspector Johnson began reviewing the shed, taking out measuring tools and leafing through county code books, I made a split-second decision that would change the trajectory of this entire conflict. "Would you like to come inside for coffee?" I asked, calm and cordial. "Since this is an official inspection, I think it's only fair I provide some historical context on this property." Margaret narrowed her eyes, suspicious of any hospitality. But Johnson nodded, clearly open to understanding what he'd walked into. Tyler stood silently in the kitchen doorway, watching as I laid out my grandfather's documents across the dining table. Right on top, like a crown jewel, was a page with that unmistakable faded red county seal impossible to ignore. "Inspector," I said evenly, "I believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding the HOA's authority to regulate this property. Based on these records, it seems they never had jurisdiction here to begin with." Margaret's face twisted not with confusion, but disbelief. This wasn't the script she'd written, and the more I spoke, the clearer it became. This was only the beginning of a rude awakening for her, one where perception of power collided with real, legal truth. By Friday morning, things escalated again. I was making eggs for Tyler when the call came in. "Mr. Westbrook, this is Sandra Chen from the County Planning Department," the voice on the line said in that neutral, bureaucratic tone that always sounds polite while still managing to sound like an order. "We've received a formal complaint regarding unpermitted construction at your address. An inspection has been scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. I thanked her and hung up. Tyler, already picking up on my unease, looked at me with those familiar worried eyes, and I realized Margaret had taken this beyond HOA territory. She was now dragging the county itself into the fight, determined to force compliance through official pressure. But what she didn't realize was these by involving county offices, she may have handed me the exact kind of legal spotlight I needed. Her campaign against me only intensified over the weekend. On Saturday, Rosa Martinez, the neighbor I thought had at least stayed neutral, showed up at my door looking deeply uncomfortable. She held her arms awkwardly across her chest and avoided my eyes. "I'm really sorry about this, Danny," she said, throwing a quick glance toward Margaret's house. "But Margaret asked me to let you know I've been concerned about noises coming from the workshop at night. Construction sounds, a broken bar hammering, that kind of thing." The thing was, I hadn't touched the workshop after dinner hours, not once. And from the look in Rose's eyes, she knew it too. But fear has a way of making people obedient. She looked more afraid of Margaret than of telling a lie to my face. By Sunday night, I'd heard from two more neighbors, the Hendersons 2 doors down and old Mr. Kowalski on the corner. Apparently, they too had concerns about noise and disruption. Margaret wasn't just launching a complaint, she was manufacturing a record of complaints. Tyler was finishing his homework while I sat in the living room, thinking. Then I picked up the phone and called the emergency weekend line for the county records office. The clerk on duty was surprisingly helpful. For another $50 rush fee, she promised I'd have an emailed copy of every document related to the Willow Creek development by Monday morning. "Just so you're aware," she added before hanging up, "you're not the only one who's asked about this property. We've had several requests for the same records recently. That's a broken bar unusual, especially for land grants this old." So Margaret had been digging, too, looking for something she could use. What she didn't realize was that the deeper you dig into a weak foundation, the more likely it is to collapse. Monday morning arrived right on schedule, and with it came Inspector Johnson, just as promised. This time, Margaret had returned with reinforcements, 2 other HOA board members in tow, all of them looking like they were about to testify in court. Margaret had clearly prepared for this moment with military precision. She handed Johnson a printed timeline of my alleged violations, a binder full of prearranged neighbor complaints, and even a map with marked problem areas. As Johnson began inspecting the shed again, taking measurements and referencing code books, Margaret narrated the whole process like a tour guide, her phone live streaming once more. "As you can see," she said to the camera, "the structure exceeds the height limitation by several inches, and neighbors have reported negative impacts on sightlines and property values. We're simply enforcing what's fair." Then my phone buzzed. It was the county clerk's email. I opened the message, intending to glance over it later, but the first document stopped me in my tracks. Right at the top, bold and undeniable, Willow Creek Estate, a original land grant to Harold Westbrook, 1987. As I scrolled through the records, my heart pounded harder with every page. It turned out my grandfather hadn't just owned his home, he'd been granted full title to the entire parcel of land that later became our neighborhood. Every home, every cul-de-sac, even the community clubhouse where Margaret held her weekly home meetings, it all sat on property legally deeded to Harold Westbrook nearly 4 decades earlier. The HOA, established in 1995, had come into existence 8 years after that land grant, and from what I could tell, no one had ever officially transferred the land out of our family's name. It was a massive oversight, or perhaps willful ignorance. Either way, it meant the HOA might have been claiming authority over land they didn't legally control. Inspector Johnson was putting away his tools when I stepped forward, a quiet certainty settling over me. "Before you finish your report," I said, holding out my phone, "there's some historical context you should see." He took the phone and began scrolling through the documents. His professional demeanor shifted almost immediately, eyebrows drawing together as he read the original land grant. Margaret, mid-sentence in her latest live stream rant, faltered and stared at us, clearly thrown off by the sudden change in energy. "What are you showing him?" she demanded, but Johnson was already dialing his office. "This is Johnson, out at the Westbrook residence on Maple Street," he said calmly into the phone. "I need someone from legal to help review land records from 1987. We might have a jurisdictional problem." The next 15 minutes were surreal, like watching a slow-motion implosion of something once thought solid. Johnson whispered back and forth with a colleague on the line while Margaret fumed and paced, clearly impatient and baffled. Finally, he turned to her with a calm yet grave tone. "Mrs. Holloway, we've hit a serious snag. Based on these documents, it appears the Homeowners Association may have been created without properly confirming ownership transfer of the land. According to county records, Mr. Westbrook's grandfather still holds title to this entire tract." Margaret's face drained of color, then flushed deep red. "That can't be," she snapped. "I've been president of this HOA for 8 years. We have full jurisdiction over every property in Willow Creek." "I understand," Johnson replied carefully, "but these records suggest your HOA might have been operating under authority it never legally had. Any fines, regulations, or enforcement actions taken over the years may not stand up to legal scrutiny." I stood silently as the weight of that revelation hit her like a freight train. Her empire built on rules, fines, and intimidation might have never had a legal foundation at all. All those years of control, all the neighborhood fear and whispered compliance, all of it now teetered on the edge of collapse. Tyler, who'd been watching through the kitchen window, came outside and quietly stood beside me. "Dad," he whispered, "does that mean the mean lady can't tell us what to do anymore?" I put an arm around him, smiling faintly. "Buddy, I think it means a whole lot more than that." Predictably, Margaret wasted no time trying to regain her grip on the situation. By Tuesday night, every household in Willow Creek received a glossy, heavy stock invitation to an urgent community meeting set for Thursday evening. The bold red headline screamed, "Protecting Our Neighborhood Values." She'd even added a subtitle that made me laugh out loud: "Special Guest to County Building Inspector Johnson to clarify recent compliance concerns." Clearly, she was trying to spin the situation, hoping a public spectacle might restore her credibility and corner me in front of an audience. What she didn't realize was that she'd just given me the perfect opportunity and stage to expose everything. The psychological warfare resumed in full force by midweek. On Wednesday morning, Tyler came downstairs looking unsettled. "Dad," he mumbled as he picked at his cereal, "some kids at school said their moms think we're in trouble with the police." I felt a fresh surge of anger. Margaret's campaign had reached elementary school now, and her efforts to isolate me were creeping into my son's social life. That evening, I passed by the community center and spotted Margaret's car and a few others in the lot. Through the windows, I saw her animatedly gesturing over piles of charts and documents, clearly prepping her loyalists for the coming showdown. By Thursday, the air had the crispness of early fall, the kind of weather that reminded me why I'd wanted Tyler to grow up in a place like this. As we walked to the community center, I noticed neighbors emerging from almost every house, making their way toward the meeting. Suburban grapevines move fast, and Margaret's emergency gathering had stirred up the kind of anticipation usually reserved for reality TV finales. Tyler stayed close, eyes darting nervously at the growing crowd. "Are you going to show them Grandpa Harold's papers?" he asked in a whisper. I squeezed his hand gently. "Not yet, kiddo. Sometimes the smartest move is letting people dig their own holes first." Inside, the community center was packed. Folding chairs had been lined up like pews, all facing a small podium where Margaret stood in her best navy blazer, radiating self-importance. She'd traded her usual clipboard for a full multimedia setup, a projector, screen, and all. Inspector Johnson sat off to the side, visibly uneasy, like a referee dragged into a family feud with no rulebook. As neighbors settled into their seats, it was clear they were here for more than just a meeting. They wanted a show. There was a clear split in the room. Half of the attendees seemed genuinely interested in hearing what Margaret had to say, while the rest looked like they'd rather be anywhere but here. Margaret opened the meeting with dramatic flair. "Friends, neighbors, residents of our beloved Willow Creek," she began, her tone thick with rehearsed authority. "We are facing a serious challenge to the values and property standards that have long made this community a model for the entire county." She began flipping through a well-prepared PowerPoint presentation. It featured photos of my grandfather's old workshop taken from nearly every possible angle, alongside graphs depicting local property trends, and even a timeline of my supposed infractions. It was obvious she'd poured hours into prepping for this. In her mind, tonight would be the grand moment she re-established her control and public image. Eventually, she turned to me with a curt nod. "Jason, you now have the floor." I rose slowly, making deliberate eye contact with the room. I wanted everyone to see I wasn't rattled. I casually held a manila folder by my side. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, voice calm. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak." Before addressing her accusations, I asked a simple question. "Margaret, would you mind showing us the original charter that grants the HOA its authority?" She hesitated for just a second, sensing the trap but not quite spotting it. "Of course," she replied, signaling to one of her board members. He handed her a neatly bound booklet. "This is the founding charter from 1995, she said confidently. "It outlines the HOA's jurisdiction over all properties in Willow Creek." I accepted the document with a polite nod, slowly flipping through it for everyone to see. It looked convincing, exactly the sort of thing that would make residents believe they were legally bound to its rules. "This is very thorough," I said. "Just to clarify, was this authority granted by the county, or by the original property owner?" She straightened her posture, answering with confidence, "By the county. We followed all the proper channels when the HOA was created." I nodded thoughtfully and raised my folder. "Interesting," I said, "because what I have here might offer some context." The room grew quiet. People leaned forward. Just then, my phone buzzed. The caller ID said it was the county legal department. Talk about timing, either incredibly lucky or suspiciously perfect. "Sorry everyone," I said. "I need to take this." I answered on speaker. "Mr. Westbrook, this is Patricia Walsh from the county legal office. We've reviewed the land documents you submitted. It appears there are substantial discrepancies in the legal formation of the Willow Creek HOA." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room. Margaret's face drained of color as the attorney continued. "There's serious uncertainty regarding whether the HOA was properly authorized. Until we complete a full legal review, all enforcement actions must be put on hold." I thanked her and ended the call. Margaret stood frozen behind the podium, her elaborate presentation now meaningless in the face of official scrutiny. Inspector Johnson cleared his throat and stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable. "Well folks," he said, "it looks like there are some pretty significant legal matters that need to be clarified before we can proceed with anything." As I glanced around the room, I saw expressions shift from confusion to realization. People were starting to understand that Margaret's power might not be as legitimate as she claimed. Her clipboard sagged in her hand as she struggled to regroup. From the front row, Tyler grinned up at me, fully aware that his dad had just pulled off something big. As the crowd broke into side conversations, I quietly approached Margaret at the podium. "Margaret," I said softly, "you might want to revisit the original land grants from 1987. Sometimes the foundation you think you're standing on turns out to be hollow." Her eyes narrowed. She stared at me, trying to gauge how deep my knowledge went and how much trouble she might actually be in. Tomorrow, Willow Creek was going to wake up to a very different reality. "I'm Jason Miller, writing to you from Chicago. Let me ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have dropped the hammer at that meeting? Or would you have done what I did to let her overplay her hand first? Let me know in the comments. And trust me, Broken Bar, you won't want to miss what happens next." Friday morning brought Margaret's most desperate move yet. I was packing Tyler's lunch when I heard the roar of her SUV in the driveway. But she wasn't alone. Inspector Johnson stepped out of the passenger seat looking like a man who regretted every decision that led him here. Margaret climbed out on the driver's side, radiating confidence like she believed this was her comeback moment. Behind them, a white van pulled up. Channel 7 News. She was going all in on turning this into a spectacle. She thought bringing the media would pressure me into surrender. What she didn't know was that I had spent the entire night getting ready for just this sort of stunt. She marched to my front door with the swagger of someone about to deliver a knockout blow. "Mr. Westbrook," she announced loudly, making sure the camera picked it up, "Inspector Johnson is here to resume the county's assessment, which your legal theatrics interrupted yesterday, and we're joined by Channel 7 News to ensure complete transparency." The reporter, a young woman who clearly drew the short straw, stood poised with her mic, her cameraman already rolling, ready for drama. Tyler peeked from behind me, fascinated by the TV crew, but stayed close. He knew this wasn't over. Inspector Johnson sighed and pulled out his tools. "Mrs. Holloway," he said carefully, "I must remind you that the county legal department has raised unresolved jurisdictional issues. I'm not sure we should continue until those are fully addressed." Margaret waved off his concerns like they were irrelevant formalities. "Inspector, we're dealing with a clear code violation that impacts our entire community's property values. Legal paperwork can be sorted out later. Right now, we need to enforce the rules." Margaret turned toward the camera with the poise of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this moment. "This is exactly why HOAs exist," she declared, "to protect our neighborhoods from individuals who believe they're above the rules." That's when I knew it was time to play my final hand. I stepped inside briefly and returned carrying the manila folder that had sat untouched in my grandfather's safe for decades, now paired with the updated county records I had recently secured. "Inspector Johnson," I began, "before you proceed with your inspection, I think it's important you understand the complete historical context of this property." I handed over a yellowed document at the original land grant and watched the inspector's expression shift as he read the heading, "Willow Creek Estate, a land grant to Harold Westbrook, 1987, a full ownership." His face drained of color. Margaret, still putting on a performance for the camera, demanded to know what I'd shown him, but Johnson was already pulling out his phone, stepping aside to place a call to the county office. The next few minutes unfolded like a car accident in slow motion. The inspector whispered into his phone, his brows furrowed, while Margaret's confident facade began to fray. The reporter caught wind of the shift in tone and began asking sharper questions. "Ma'am," she asked pointedly, "can you respond to claims that the home may not actually have legal authority over this property?" Margaret's face flickered through denial, disbelief, and frustration before she snapped, "That's nonsense. I've been the HOA president for 8 years. We have all the proper documentation." But even her voice wavered, the certainty gone. The cameraman caught the moment as her usual control slipped. When Johnson finally ended his call, the tension in the air was thick. "Mrs. Holloway," he said flatly, "I just got off the phone with the county attorney. There are serious concerns regarding the legal basis of this HOA. Based on the documentation Mr. Westbrook provided, this association was formed in 1995 on land that was legally granted to his grandfather in 1987 with no record of it ever changing hands." Margaret stood frozen, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. And, Johnson added, until these property ownership issues are legally clarified, I can't move forward with any enforcement actions. It appears this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. The reporter's eyes gleamed, sensing a story far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. Are you saying that the HOA's actions over the past 8 years could be invalid? She asked. Johnson gave a slow, grim nod. That's exactly what I'm saying. Every fine, every citation, every action taken could be subject to legal review. Margaret looked like the ground had been pulled out from under her. 8 years of strong-arming neighbors, enforcing fines, and running the community with unchecked authority now on the verge of collapse. I stepped toward the camera, speaking directly to the viewers. I'm not trying to tear down this community, I said calmly, but any group that claims power over someone's private property should be able to prove that authority beyond a doubt. Margaret found her voice, but it came out as a desperate shriek. This is a setup. Those documents could be fake. I demand a full investigation. Johnson shook his head solemnly. Ma'am, the records have already been authenticated by the county office. The seals are legitimate. The chain of ownership is intact. The news crew began packing up, clearly thrilled by the turn their story had taken. Margaret, still clinging to any shred of control, made one last effort. Even if there's confusion about the original charter, she argued, we've functioned as a legitimate HOA for nearly a decade. That has to count for something. But Johnson wasn't having it. I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway. In property law, time doesn't establish authority. Legitimacy must be based on lawful origin, not duration. He turned to me, now speaking with a tone of professional respect. Mr. Westbrook, the county legal office will contact you soon to discuss your property's status and how this impacts the broader neighborhood. Margaret trudged back to her SUV, defeated and distant, while Tyler looked up at me, his hand squeezing mine. Dad, he said softly, does that mean we can keep Grandpa's workshop? I smiled, the weight of weeks finally lifting. Tyler, I replied, I think this means a lot more than that. I think we're finally about to learn what Grandpa was trying to show us all along. The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret's desperate effort to weaponize his authority and the media had backfired completely. In trying to crush me, she'd ended up exposing the truth about herself. Sometimes the most effective way to stop a bully is simply to give them enough rope to hang their own credibility. The Channel 7 segment aired Sunday evening under a headline that nearly made me spill my coffee. Local HOA has no legal authority. A 8-year power grab exposed. The reporter had gone all in interviewing legal experts, county officials, and even locating 3 other residents who'd been harassed by HOA enforcement actions under Margaret's reign. By Monday morning, my phone was lighting up with calls to neighbors, journalists, and a growing list of attorneys all eager to jump into the fray. Tyler watched it all with fascination while I tried to get him ready for school amidst the chaos. Are we famous now, Dad? He asked, his eyes wide. And honestly, I wasn't sure how to answer. Margaret, however, wasn't done. By Tuesday evening, every mailbox in Willow Creek had received a hand-delivered flyer, an invitation to what she called a community truth session scheduled for Wednesday night. The language felt often more panicked than powerful. Neighbors, we must not allow outside influences and media distortion to destroy what we've built. Please attend tomorrow night's meeting to hear the real truth behind recent events threatening our community values. She even included a dire warning: if the situation continued, property values would collapse. Margaret tried to regain control by tapping into every homeowner's biggest fear: property values. She sent out hand-delivered letters warning that dismantling the HOA would spell financial disaster. But what she didn't grasp was that her increasingly panicked tone was starting to alienate people rather than rally them. The questions she was hoping to silence were only growing louder. That night's meeting at the community center was unlike anything Willow Creek had seen. The room was overflowing. A resident stood along the walls, spilled into the hallway, and murmured with anticipation. Margaret had pulled together all her allies, but the crowd wasn't what it used to be. Alongside familiar faces were those I recognized from the news: county representatives, legal observers, and even a few reporters scribbling notes. Margaret took her usual place at the podium, but the commanding presence she'd once projected was diminished. Her navy blazer was replaced by a somber black dress like she was attending a funeral. In some ways, perhaps she was. She began with a heartfelt speech, laced with just enough emotion to feel carefully rehearsed. She recounted how she arrived in Willow Creek after losing everything to mismanagement in her former neighborhood. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke of vowing to protect this community from similar chaos. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. It became clear this wasn't just about control. It was about someone who had once been powerless and had come to believe that strict, unyielding authority was the only way to prevent history from repeating. But that glimpse of vulnerability didn't last. Her tone shifted quickly, and she pointed straight at me. "Now we have an outsider," she declared. "Someone who came here with a hidden agenda to dismantle everything we've built. He's using legal loopholes and media drama to destroy our standards." There were murmurs of discomfort throughout the room. Her voice sharpened with urgency. "If we let this attack succeed, Willow Creek will become just another unregulated mess. Property values will crash. Families will lose everything." Some heads nodded in agreement. Fear has a way of silencing doubt. Then she called on me to speak. I rose slowly, understanding that what I said next could shape the future of the neighborhood. "Thank you, Margaret," I began. "I understand your concerns, and I want to address them head-on." I scanned the room, locking eyes with people I hoped to reassure. "I didn't move here to tear this community apart. I came here so my son could grow up in a place where people care about one another, where we solve problems together." I paused to let the words settle. "But any group that claims authority over our homes and our lives must have the legal right to do so." "That's not a loophole, that's the principle our system is built on," Margaret interrupted, her tone bordering on frantic. "Democracy? You want to talk about democracy? I was elected president by the people of this neighborhood. That's more democratic than inheriting a property and using it to override the will of dozens of families." Her voice was rising, and I could see that even some of her staunchest supporters were beginning to squirm in their seats. Then she made a dramatic move. "If you think our authority isn't valid, let's put it to the test. I propose a vote of confidence in the current HOA leadership. Let's see who this community really trusts." Before I could respond, Frank Chen stood up, a quiet, respected man, a retired engineer. His voice carried quiet authority. "Margaret, maybe we need to take a step back. The county raised real concerns about how our HOA was formed. Instead of fighting that, maybe we should focus on resolving it properly." Margaret's expression darkened. "Frank, you've been misled. She gestured at me again, is using fear and confusion to break down what we've built." But Frank stood his ground. "Margaret, the fear and confusion aren't coming from him. I've reviewed our financials. Over the last few years, we've collected more than $50,000 in fines and FESA, but I can't find clear records showing how much of that went toward actual community improvements." The room went still. Then Frank pulled out a folder of his own. "And several residents have come to me privately. They believe the fines they paid weren't legally enforceable. If our authority to impose those penalties is in question, we could be facing a very serious situation." That's when Rosa Martinez spoke up from the back. "I paid $300 last year for painting my fence the wrong beige. If we didn't have the right to regulate that, I want a refund." Her voice sparked a wave of similar stories. One by one, people began sharing their own frustrations of fines for mailbox height, garden gnomes, and paint colors. Margaret stood frozen, watching everything she'd worked to build begin to crumble before her eyes. Then, a quiet voice from the back commanded the room. County Attorney Patricia Walsh stood up. "I've been authorized by the county to share an official update regarding the legal status of this homeowners association," she began, and every sound in the room fell away. The county attorney's words hit like a thunderclap. The HOA had never possessed legitimate legal authority over the properties it claimed to govern. Effective immediately, all rules, penalties, and enforcement measures were to be suspended, pending a full legal review. Margaret's composure crumbled. She dropped into the chair behind her podium, her 8-year grip on Willow Creek officially severed by a legal ruling that nullified the very structure she built her identity around. In the 2 weeks that followed, Willow Creek underwent a quiet but remarkable transformation. Kids rode their bikes freely along the sidewalks, no longer worried about being reprimanded by clipboard-carrying patrols. Neighbors greeted one another warmly from their porches, and the once controlled community Facebook group had evolved into a genuine space for residents to plan block parties and coordinate carpools. Tyler, for the first time, had made friends of 3 of them and spent his afternoons exploring the neighborhood with a kind of joy only possible when children are given room to breathe. Watching him laugh as he and his friends built a fort in the backyard, I knew this was the life I'd envisioned for him when we first arrived. Surprisingly, the transition of the HOA itself was seamless. Frank Chen took over as interim president, forming a volunteer committee to implement transparent and democratic procedures. Monthly decrees had been replaced by quarterly public meetings where neighbors could express concerns and vote on fair regulations. Financial records were published online, and one of Frank's first orders of business was to audit fines imposed under Margaret's rule. Rosa Martinez received her $300 refund that very week, along with a formal apology for the beige fence incident, which had since become a bit of a neighborhood legend. But even success has its shadows. Mine arrived 3 months later in a thick envelope bearing the name Bradley Morrison and Associates. My stomach tightened as I opened the letter. "Dear Mr. Westbrook," it began in polished legal jargon. The letter explained that Councilman Bradley Morrison, head of the County Development Committee, had raised concerns about the precedent our neighborhood's HOA dissolution might set. It hinted that the land I inherited from my grandfather could become subject to eminent domain if it posed an obstacle to future development plans. I reread it, coffee cooling beside me. The name rang a bell. Bradley Morrison. It clicked. He was the son of Betty Morrison, the kind neighbor who had supported me with baked goods and warm stories about my grandfather. Could she have unintentionally revealed something that was now being used to undermine our progress? The timing was too perfect to ignore, just as things were finally beginning to settle. That night, while Tyler worked on his homework, I dug back into my grandfather's records. At the bottom of an old manila folder, I found a document I hadn't noticed before: a separate legal trust, created just 6 months before Harold passed away. It outlined a fund designed to protect the rights of Willow Creek residents from future political or municipal overreach. The trust was substantial enough to mount serious legal defenses if needed, but more striking than the trust itself was a handwritten note clipped to it. "Danny, if you're reading this, it means someone is trying to challenge our stewardship of this land. This trust is meant to protect the rights of our neighbors and not just our familia from those who would abuse power, whether it's an overreaching HOA president or an opportunistic politician." Even in death, Harold Westbrook was thinking 3 steps ahead of protecting not just our family, but the entire community. The next morning, an unexpected letter arrived from the neighboring township of Cedar Grove. It was signed by dozens of residents. "Mr. Westbrook," it read, "we've heard about your efforts in Willow Creek. We're dealing with similar issues in HOA that acts more like a regime than a service organization. Would you consider helping us examine the legality of our own association?" Soon, more letters came in, some from other counties, each with their own version of the Margaret problem. Tyler, watching the pile of envelopes grow, looked up from his cereal with a grin. "Dad, you're kind of like a superhero for people with cranky neighbors." He paused, then added with bright eyes and budding ambition, "Maybe we should start a YouTube channel. I bet a lot of people would watch you take down Bully Essa with paperwork." Looking at the excitement in my son's face, then at the pile of letters on the counter, I had the strange feeling that our suburban skirmish was just the opening act of something much bigger. But first, I had to deal with Councilman Bradley Morrison and whatever aspirations had driven him to try to reclaim control over a community that had just rediscovered its voice. If there's one thing I'd learned from Margaret's downfall, it's this: bullies never work alone. And the bigger they are, the more satisfying it is when they fall. Feeling powerless against your HOA or neighborhood tyrants? You're not alone. Subscribe to Ya Story Essa, where we shine a light on abuse of power and fight for your right to live free from control. Even if your HOA wants to shut us down, we'll keep going. Because storytelling is resistencia, and sometimes, resistance is exactly what a neighborhood needs. We'll see you at the next emergency board meeting.